Welcome, everyone, to what I hope will be another great EUVC podcast episode. Today, we're connecting with our industrial tech friends, those who built the literal foundations of Europe. We're sitting down with Sebastian Peck, partner at KOMPAS VC, the leading name in Europe when it comes to industrial tech and decarbonizing manufacturing and the built world. With KOMPAS is gearing up for a new big announcement, it's the perfect time to dive into how this often overlooked but mission-critical segment of our ecosystem is shaping up, geopolitically, regulatorily, and entrepreneurially. We'll unpack everything from corporate LP dynamics to the increasing need for specialist VCs and the rise of new strategic VC alliances. This one's for the builders of factories, of systems, and European resilience. Before we start the show, a quick note. If you're building or running a fund, you know it takes the right partners. At EUVC, we only work with sponsors we truly believe should be part of your tech stack. Please do take a moment to hear about them. And if you do, reach out, mention EUVC. It's the best way you can support what we do. Thank you so much. Starting off, HSBC Innovation Banking. If you're a founder, a scale-up, or a VC, you need a bank that actually understands your world. HSBC Innovation Banking backs innovation globally, from seed to IPO. And if you ask me, a strong banking partner like HSBC belongs in your stack. If your portfolio companies are scaling, they need infrastructure that won't slow them down. Google Cloud Starter Program offers $2,000 to $350,000 in credits, plus technical support to build better and faster. It's a key boost every fund should bring into their ecosystem, and oh my God, are we thankful to be partnering with them. Now, legal is a space you cannot lag on. Legal needs to move at the speed of venture. Goodwin's team has decades of experience with startups and funds. They're trusted at every stage from formation to exit. Goodwin definitely is a legal partner every serious manager should have in their stack. For Luxembourg-based VC, PE, and fund-of-fund managers, modern funds means going digital. Fundcraft gives you a full-service, digital-native platform built for today's European managers. It's a must-have if you're scaling smart. So we all hear about the Middle East. How about you go there? From AI to deep tech to sovereign fund, Skytech in Dubai is where global future of tech gets negotiated. It's not just a conference, it's where East meets West, capital meets innovation, and the bold set the agenda. If you're playing on the global stage, join us going to Skytech this year. If you're gearing up for your next fundraise and want a placement agent who truly understands emerging managers, reach out to C Funds. They're a boutique placement agency that has helped GPs across Europe raise capital from top-tier LPs. We've been on the other side of the table here. They are actually good ones to work with. So I do urge you to go to cfunds.io to go and check them out. And hey, before you go, if you're looking to discover startups, raise capital, or connect with innovation leaders, do check out dealflow.eu, the EU-backed platform bridging founders, VCs, and corporates. There's no better place to find the startups that have received significant funding from the European innovation ecosystem.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
Sebastian, welcome to the pod, my friend.
Thank you for having me, Andreas. Looking forward to this.
So, Sebastian, let's get some definitions out of the way. How do you define the European industrial tech opportunity?
So, industrial technology, in the way we define it at KOMPAS, really encompasses three dimensions. Decarbonizing industrial activity, which is anything from producing goods to generating energy. So any form of activity that involves the production of things or of energy. The second element is productivity. So anything around increasing, enhancing productivity, so the throughput in the way we produce things to make that more efficient. And then thirdly, we talk a lot about resilience, which of course is now, a big term. We've been doing this for a very long time. We've always been thinking about it in the context of protecting corporate assets, making sure that companies don't suffer any harm from, either malicious activity, think cyber attacks, for example, from geopolitical events, think supply chain disruptions or tariff barriers. So it's really a complex of use cases and problems that we are tackling that are faced by our industrial complex.
You mentioned decarbonization a couple of times, and it's obviously central and has been for a long time. I had a big discussion the other day with a friend of mine on this word. Are we in the like, because we were talking about a panel that was going to be called something with energy transition, and then I said, well, is that really where we want to take this conversation? Is it transition still? Because it kind of seems like, yes, but it's all good with transition, and yes, we need every single power source that we have, but in reality, what we just need is as much power, and whether it comes from coal or nat gas or a more green alternative is not that important anymore. At least that's what we keep hearing from our US counterparts now. Where are we in this landscape today? What do you hear from your corporate partners, from your LPs, from your founders, from the regulatory environment?
We are living in a politically charged environment, and I think that debate has become quite a difficult one in many, many ways. Fundamentally, if you look at it from a European vantage point, and certainly from the vantage point of KOMPAS, clean sources of energy need to be built out, and it's paramount that we really change the mix and the way we generate energy. That's absolutely essential from our point of view. Clearly, when you look at the US and when you look at the political sort of undercurrents there, that isn't the consensus anymore. And that is certainly challenging. Of course, we do in the moment need all the power we can get. You have a massive technological wave that is sweeping over us. Artificial intelligence is an extremely power hungry technology. When you look at some of the projections, it's mind boggling. And that means we really have to make sure that we build out energy generation, but we do it in a responsible way. I think burning more fossil fuel is not going to be the solution. I think there are alternatives. Nuclear is having a big comeback. The technology is certainly finding a lot of favor again. At KOMPAS, we haven't really dedicated a lot of time on it or looked very deeply into it. But certainly when you look at what's happening both in the US and in Europe, there is a lot of momentum behind it. So that seems to be one pathway to meet the demand for more power, but do so in a way that isn't increasing CO2 emissions.
Can I ask you though, so nuclear is coming up and you're also saying we need to find greener solutions or at least not burning more fossil fuel solutions to the energy need. And I can see both sides of the argument, right? You can take that. If you take the US argument, it is we have global competition and we definitely are playing against players that do not care. And thus, if we choose to pick our more high horse route of going the green way, we will lose. And that's not an option. So for that reason, we got to go this way. In Europe, I kind of hear two arguments. I hear some that say the same and say, well, we got to just full steam ahead. Every single opportunity to create cheaper and more energy, we got to go that way. And then we have others that say, well, this is a huge opportunity to us, because when the US are not paying attention to the green transition and decarbonization and so on, we have a massive opportunity set, because everyone who cares about this will have to come to Europe and will have to work with our companies, so to say. And that will put us in front. On where do you land? Where do you see the space and what do you hear in the market? It's maybe...
To be honest, I don't think that's a real argument. I mean, if you take the big foe the US is fighting against, I mean, China is really the leader in clean energy and renewables, right? So I think the technology is there. And of course, if you have a sudden surge in demand and you don't have all the capacity, you need to be pragmatic. I don't dispute this. And there's a big difference between having a long-term strategy and recognizing that we need to decarbonize our energy mix and then working towards that, taking pragmatic steps in between to meet industrial demand, to meet the demand for new technologies. But if you don't have a strategy, if you don't have a goal, you make policy decisions that ultimately take in a very, very different direction. And you see that's happening in the US. The US is clamping down on wind. It's capping various subsidies for a variety of other technologies, from electric vehicles to solar, etc. So you see in the US, there's a conscious choice being made not to pursue net zero as a goal for ideological reasons. And that is very different to saying, let's be pragmatic in the short term and work with what we have, but define a very clear North Star where we need to get to in order to mitigate the impact of climate change. And so I think as a European and from a European vantage point, I would clearly fall into the camp that says, let's be pragmatic in the short term, work with what we have, but be also very, very clear and targeted where we need to get to. I hope that the European Union sticks to that policy goal.
And that is also what you hear and see from your corporate actors that you work with and the customers of your startups and so on.
Yeah, what you certainly see is a much more fragmented landscape. I think in the Nordics, for example, you continue to see a very, very strong commitment towards decarbonization. If you talk to some of the largest players in the Nordic region, there's a very, very clear commitment to stick to those policies and corporate goals. If you're going to the US, there's much more ambivalence and there's much more reframing of corporate goals involved. Some of it is now much more focused on creating a mix, to meet the energy demand that basically makes use of all available means. So not explicitly pursuing renewables, but continuing to sort of add them to the mix. We just have to accept the fact that the world isn't sort of speaking in a unified way about how we tackle these challenges. And you will effectively see a world where you have now three systems. You have the US, which is on a very, very different path to Europe, which again is on a different path to China. I think the European Union had a moment where it recognized it is in a sense on its own when it comes to pursuing its policy goals. We are now in a very, very interesting phase where decoupling from the US, while it was being talked about, hasn't really happened. And we're in this sort of, quite murky middle caught between China on the one hand side and the US on the other. And I think Europe really needs to define what it stands for and what it wants to be and how it pursues its goals while obviously creating a viable economic foundation, which in this current environment is clearly very, very challenging.
Now we spoke a bunch about the energy side of this and the decarbonization part. Let's talk a bit about digital transformation and the productivity gains that you're also heavily investing in when it comes to industrial tech, of course. Tell me about, because obviously one side of AI is what we just spoke about. The other is is how do we use it and how do we deploy it in our industrial base?
So AI is clearly a game-changing technology. I mean, nothing new there, right? And we are now in this sort of interesting phase where you see extremely successful companies being built, catering to use cases that get, widespread adoption. Think Lovable, for example, creating websites. So we now see this diffusion of this technology in a sort of consumer and increasingly in a business setting as well. I think there's still a leap that needs to happen for this technology to be truly enterprise ready. We see a lot of companies, a lot of corporates we work with in our industry network, experimenting with the technology, making sort of incremental steps towards business process automation. Certainly looking at the opportunities of the technology in manufacturing settings, for example. But there are clearly security concerns. There are clearly input-output challenges. Very often there's still data challenges if you really want to train the AI on very specific use cases, really collating the data and making it available and ingesting into these systems. That still is a challenge for a lot of companies. So getting AI ready is really the order of the day for any corporate that wants to remain competitive over the next decade.
Where do you see them focusing the most on figuring out a good route to adoption, and where do you see the blockers being?
One of the main blockers is really very often data. And that will remain still a challenge for some time to come. Talking specifically about European company, a lot of companies still find it very, very challenging to really get their arms around their own proprietary data and consolidating that data in one single place and making it really accessible to those systems. And that requires investment. It requires a level of commitment to really create the foundation, the infrastructure to be able to implement those AI tools. It's not a problem that's new. It's a problem that's also very often been a challenge for the adoption of enterprise software and sort of big data solutions. And it's sometimes a little bit frustrating that there hasn't been more progress on that front. But if companies get this right, if companies really are able to consolidate, process, cleanse their data, make it available for trading purposes, then they sit on enormous opportunities to really improve the way they operate, to eke out efficiencies, and to become just much, much better companies.
And where do you then focus primarily? So this is one of the main blockers. Is that also where one of the main opportunities for startups is? So where do you see the most exciting space right now?
Clearly, agentic AI and the ability to orchestrate a multitude of agents and have them deliver tasks, especially more structured or more complex tasks, that's a very, very exciting area. And we see a lot of innovation there. That's clearly where all the VC money in the moment is headed. The problem or the challenge I described before is more the kind of homework that the customer really has to do to be able to, benefit from that technology in the best possible way. So agentic software is really now the frontier. This is an area where we will look very, very closely at in the next 6 months to figure out, okay, what are the kind of companies we can back that speak to use cases and speak to applications that fit within the KOMPAS portfolio.
And I got to ask you about robotics, because robotics is obviously a big rage. Some say, it's primarily people from outside of traditional robotics, I would say, they are incredibly excited about what's happening now. And then every time I talk to someone who's invested for years and years in robotics, they tend to say, not that much changed.
Yeah, it depends on what your ultimate level of ambition is here, right? If you look at advanced manufacturing companies, their plants are highly, highly automated. If you go to a car factory today, you hardly see any people walking across the floor. And that's not only the case today, that was the case, for the last couple of decades. So in an industrial setting, robotics is already quite advanced. Now, the way it operates, it's very, very focused. So, you set specific tasks, you assemble a car, for example, and the robots then deliver very, very specific tasks. They don't make decisions. They don't come up with creative ways to do something differently or to improve themselves, right? So what we're talking about now is really this sort of sense of, can robots, in a sense, have agency and start to really have an impact on improving an industrial process? And at the sort of lowest level, you can think about it, as a sort of information processing challenge. If you have more data, and you allow the robot to effectively, analyze the situation and find a pathway to a better solution, then that is certainly very, very interesting in a number of industrial settings. When you sort of go to the other sort of end of the spectrum, a fully autonomous robot who is almost human-like and effectively is replacing a human worker in all aspects and has this general intelligence and is able to make completely autonomous decisions. I think there's still a lot of robotics problems that we need to solve. Anything ranging from dexterity to the way perception works in robots that need to be solved in order to really be able to get to that stage. So I think for a lot of industrial use cases, the next wave of technology is incredibly exciting because it introduces the possibility of continuous improvement. But I think we're still some way off a fully autonomous, robot that can replace any human in carrying out work tasks.
If you were to be super clear on this, where do you fall on the Optimus humanoid robot versus and that world versus the worldview that now we'll still have primarily in the industrial base robots that are, if not single purpose, then multi-purpose or some version of that?
I think it will be a transition that will take quite some time, because you also need to think about, CapEx cycles. A manufacturer like, let's say, BMW is not going to replace its robots every couple of years just because there's an incremental improvement in the technology, or even if it's a big improvement in the technology. Setting up these factories, making them tick, and making them work flawlessly still takes tremendous efforts. I think the CapEx cycles are sort of a natural constraint there. The other topic is really, at the end of the day, what do you really need? I mean, just because you can have the most fancy technology, it doesn't mean you necessarily need it if you are just bending metal, for example, right? So there's a question of if you have the Optimus robot who can literally do everything, what are really the use cases where you need that type of machine? I come back to the car factory. You don't see humans in a sort of modern car factory, not to the degree you used to. And that means you can do a lot of tasks very well with this existing setup. That isn't to say that, you don't want continuous innovation, but I'm never really one for the hype, I have to say. I always sort of try and think through the practical implementation challenges, the, if you like, adoption hurdles that exist in complex organizations, and how they think about adopting and incorporating these new technologies into workflows. I love a good story, but I'm also always very skeptical about the sort of, time to adoption. And I think these robots evolve very fast. The technology evolves very fast. But I also don't think that in the next, 2, 3, 5 years, they will become so ubiquitous that they will replace, any existing setup. In that case, I have a little bit more of a pragmatic view.
You touch on something that, of course, industrial tech is very known for, which is, of course, that fact that change happens slower than in SaaS and consumer tech. Convincing procurement and operations leaders in large enterprises is just a very difficult hurdle to get over, and something that startups often underestimate. So in this context, I'd love to ask you, how do you balance breakthrough innovation with practical challenges of adoption in such an entrenched and risk-averse industry?
We really pride ourselves of having a very, very strong industry network. And then the advantage of that industry network is that we are constantly talking to people. We are constantly trying to understand how ready these corporates are for new technologies, what the type of challenges are they need to master in order to really be able to shift from one technology paradigm to the next. And very often what you find is rather banal things. It comes down to budget considerations, or organizations being very focused onto themselves because they're going through restructuring programs. They are under pressure to deliver results. That these are often things that delay true innovation and really changing things, and changing complex organizations, changing the way they work. It's not a trivial task. And one of the challenges we have as investors, as you rightly point out, is to kind of bridge the gap between, of course, the optimism, of founders and also investors, and the excitement about new technology and new innovations, and then sort of managing that process when that innovation really hits the real world, is faced, with these rather mundane problems until it's successfully implemented. And then of course, the other dimension to all of this is also how different markets also respond to new innovation with regulation. And I think it will be very, very interesting to see how this plays out for artificial intelligence. If you look at the narrative that's being sported in the moment, especially in Silicon Valley, about AI effectively killing pretty much any job anyone has these days, I just can't see that happening from a regulatory, from a political perspective, because it would lead to a complete societal collapse. The engagement, especially of policymakers, with this technology over the next 5 or so years is going to be absolutely critical, and it will probably be very different in the US and in China and in Europe. And it will be very, very interesting to see how that is going to shape those societies and how those societies function.
Could you unpack that a bit for me? Because that's an interesting perspective.
If you take the notion that AI is going to replace, most jobs, and most people will not be able to make a living in a conventional way, go out in the morning, go to their desk, do a job. then clearly you have a societal problem. What are these people going to do? And of course, there will be some who find this, very, very liberating. If you find some sort of social redistribution, financial redistribution mechanism, whether it's UBI or something else, that might work for some people, but I don't think it will work for society at large.
Personally, do you think that we are looking into a scenario where this is a significant potential risk? That AI actually becomes a job displacement and destroyer rather than a creator of new types of jobs? Because you, of course, hear the argument constantly that well, everyone also thought that everything would end in graphic design when we started to have computers, but then all of a sudden we had even more graphic designers. You just focused on different work.
If you look at history, if you look at the Industrial Revolution, if you look at technological shifts, the conventional outcome was always that in the end, collectively, we were all better off. But some parts of society suffered, right? I mean, you look at the 1970s and 80s, you look at the steel and coal industry, clearly, there was a lot of job displacement, but overall societies prospered through globalization. I think it's unclear whether with AI, we will see a similar dynamic where, yes, there will be some jobs that will get replaced, but overall, many, many new jobs will be created. That at this point is I think completely unclear, because we haven't really seen whether the technology in the moment is on a trajectory. That trajectory allows us to have a good glimpse of what it could be in the future if that trajectory continues. Whether that trajectory continues, remains to be seen. If it continues, then very clearly, I think most of the things that we do as humans, both white collar and blue collar work, could be completely replaceable. If that is the case, then clearly we need to think about societal solutions, what that means, and how that impacts social cohesion, how that impacts, the way our political systems work.
And then you said that how this all plays out will likely be different in the US and China versus Europe. And you said it much will depend on how our regulators and policymakers engage with the technology. And I love to understand that side of your thinking.
If we take the US, I think the outcomes there will largely depend on ability of corporate actors to influence policy frameworks. So the amount of regulation that comes to bear down, for example, on artificial intelligence is in the US in many ways a function of, the degree of influence corporates can exert over the shaping of their policy. I think that's a well-known fact. In Europe, I think that process doesn't quite work in the same way. You have a stronger political power base that takes probably a more antagonistic stance when it feels that societal cohesion or the fabric of society is going to be fundamentally disrupted by that technology. And so I can see many more interventions in Europe to prevent the worst effects of the displacement, if it comes, of jobs by AI. Whereas I think the US will probably let that mechanism play out, in a way that probably Europe won't. China is anyone's guess, I think.
It's an incredibly interesting discussion. You describe one view, which is that the US will have more dominant market forces and more dominant corporate capture of the regulatory environment, which will mean that since basically the winnings will accrue to the incumbents and large players, they will want to enable AI technology to spread across.
If you take that dynamic plus the complete lack of a social security sort of, framework, that is a very, very combustive mix, I think, when you think about what that means for that society.
And yes, I think we all recognize that there's a risk of this scenario. Some think that it's a 1% risk, so others say 20. Where do you, from this vantage point where we are today, where do you then act? In the US, I think that it does seem very much that the new administration is full on. they are saying it's a risk. We think it's a very small risk. We've never seen it in any technological leap before that we had massive displacement, as everyone kind of thought that it would be before the technological disruption happened. So for that reason, most likely it will not happen again. That seems to be their route. In Europe, I think you're absolutely right. Obviously we see the same thing, but it seems like we in Europe have chosen to err on the side of caution a little more. As an example, we have the AI Safety Act, which is, some would applaud and say it's great, because I had a guy from the AI office on the podcast, and what he said was, well, Andreas, don't you want someone to be looking after the plastics that are in the products that you use and the food, and like we need a rule set for that, and for that reason we need that for AI as well, because it's also going to affect everything, and what we have made is something that affects the big players, and this is their line of arguments, and why you would think that the AI Safety Act is a good one. I honestly don't know where I come down on this, because I can definitely also see, the US voices or the free market voices come down on this and say, well, this is regulatory capture in the end. You don't know it, but the fact of the matter is that no startup can live up to these requirements. You can't keep up. The regulation we made today is going to be archaic tomorrow, because as an example, you have the big example with the regulation being dependent on the number of tokens that are ingested in the model in the training data, and that is not what matters anymore. I just do not know if I think that we're on the right path if we are being more protective. Where do you come down on this, Sebastian?
I should say, first of all, I mean, I'm not a politician, right? We have talked about policy making regulation, but at the end of the day, I'm an investor, and as an investor, my obligation is to maximize our financial returns, and we will back the best technologies that are out there. But what I do have to factor in is the market environment into which these technologies will be launched. What I expect to be a very different, setting in the US versus Europe. I think Europe is clearly very focused, much more focused on regulation and regulating industries, maybe at a point in time when that feels like overkill. And I have definitely sympathy for that view. But I also have sympathy for that view that you do need certain standards, and you do certainly need a level of oversight, for example, when it comes to the safety of these models. I don't think the EU AI Safety Act is necessarily the best tool to accomplish that in its current shape and form. The EU has unfortunately always a bit of a heavy-handed sort of approach to these matters. Very often when you look at regulation in the UK, it seems that it's much, much more pragmatic. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement of how we think about regulation when it comes to making sure we strike the right balance between, not curtailing the forces of innovation and curtailing entrepreneurship and sort of stifling the pace of progress. But at the same time, I also think it can't be a free for all, especially with the technology that clearly has some very significant downsides as well.
And I would love to tie this then back to the conversation we're having around industrial tech, because I do think that there is an important point in everything that we're doing on a regulatory basis that impacts how the models can be deployed in Europe, obviously will affect what startups can do and cannot do. And I'd love to ask you, when you look at the current regulatory pathway or route trajectory we're on in Europe, do you see us creating more opportunities for ourselves or fewer? And where do you see that we are particularly well advantaged?
It's really important to understand what makes good regulation or what makes bad regulation, right? What makes bad regulation is if you're trying to protect the status quo. As an example, you protect the taxi trade, which has been clearly not the most efficient way to provide mobility, and you sort of try and clamp down on, ride-hailing providers. That's bad. good regulation is identifying externalities, so things that are caused by a new technology and new innovation that are clearly detrimental or harmful to the interests of society at large, right? If I create a technology that has potentially a harmful impact on the fabric of society, and I'm able to identify, articulate what those harmful effects are, then I need to find a regulatory framework that sets out, if the technology eventually causes these effects, here is how we're going to mitigate that. It might be a societal mechanism like a financial redistribution model, for example. It might be that you say, okay, if this happens, then we have to, shut things down. That really depends on the specific case in question. But as a society, we have to have a clear idea what is acceptable as an externality and what is not acceptable, and then really not so much dictate how we get there, or not be prescriptive as to what you can do or can't do, but really make sure that these harmful effects, if the technology causes them, that there's a solution how to address that. And I think that is typically what good regulation ends up doing.
I'd love to ask you, and this is a bit of a switch in the conversation, but because you have quite some experience in working with incumbents and in the industrial VC playbook, I'd love to ask you a bit about how you see partnerships being with industry leaders being a route for startups and also VCs to be successful in the space of industrial tech.
VCs can really add a lot of value in that regard. In our case, we have a platform team. That platform team consists of individuals who have very strong background in the industries we invest in, are able to open doors, make connections through our network, and then facilitate conversations ranging from an initial proof of concept all the way to brokering a commercial agreement. And in particular, in the sort of initial phase when companies need to find product market fit, we can be quite helpful in helping provide access to potential customers, to establish a feedback loop, to help enter new markets, for example, if a product needs to be localized. So there are a range of ways in which we can be useful on that journey towards product market fit. And then, when companies win over their first, major clients in any given market.
Every single startup I have met working in this space have tried to have a very difficult relationship with a corporate player. Far too often, I think I saw a post by Paul Graham the other day on X saying something along the lines of, this is the most usual investor update from someone working in the industrial space. And then it had basically an investor update from the startups that said that we've worked with X corporate for years. We've tried to solve it. We thought we would get a lot out of it. Turns out that they were more here to learn from us and take advantage than actually become a big paying customer in the end.
That's something where I think, again, a good, well-functioning platform of a VC can add a lot of value. So understanding, is the corporate actually set up to run a project? Do they have the budget? Do they have a clearly defined owner of that project? Is there a clear commercial rationale, or do you get sort of dragged into an endless conversation about what you could be doing, which never leads to anywhere? So having these relationships and cultivating these relationships with key stakeholders who are either working within a particular function within a corporate, or, for example, run a venture clienting outfit, and making sure that their engagement is professional, is fair, is commercially minded, and is respectful of the time and resources of the startup. That is the central value add we can deliver. At the end of the day, our benefit is that we potentially work with a number of clients repeatedly, and therefore understands the dynamics and can then point the startup towards a particular company to say, we've worked with them before, here's how they operate. Or also can warn them of particular companies where we've probably, had lots of great experience and understand they're not quite ready yet. Maybe you hold off until you engage with them. So I think we can give some good pointers in that regard. And I hope, our founders appreciate that.
Sebastian, we took a foray into talking about AI and regulation. I'd love to ask you, before we close, the future of KOMPAS. Tell me a bit about, because I know that there's quite some stuff coming out.
Yeah, we've launched our second fund. We continue to make investments, of course. We have a couple of announcements in the pipeline. We've announced the big Series B for Makersite, which I'm very, very happy with. It's an amazing company doing some fantastic work, helping companies design better products and doing it in a more sustainable way, and also helping them to guard against a variety of other challenges, from tariff barriers to other things. So there is a lot of good stuff in the pipeline. We are now deploying the second fund, so we're not quite ready yet to talk about Fund 3, but that will, I'm sure, at some point also be an interesting conversation where we take things with the third fund.
Needless to say, I'm excited about that. I want to ask you one final question here, and that is a bit about the specialist versus generalist, because you're clearly a specialist, and many of the funds I've backed are also. Could you tell me a bit about why you think specialists are so important in the European venture landscape?
We are a specialist more on the market side necessarily than on the technology side, right? But what I mean by that is we understand our customer base very well. We understand the practical hurdles to getting a technology into the market, and we understand timeframes when a technology will dissipate into a market. And that really gives us, I think, an advantage in making judgment calls when we make our investments, to understand, okay, is this something that can actually scale within the necessary time frame to lead to a big outcome? That sort of knowledge of the market makes us an attractive partner to more financially or sort of traditional sort of generalist funds. We're sort of in technology terms also a generalist, because we invest across such a broad range of use cases that I wouldn't necessarily say we are the specialist when it comes to robotics. We are the specialist when it comes to a particular type of technology. We understand the technologies that are relevant to the industries we invest in very well, but we also sometimes look for specific topics. We look to funds that have even more sort of targeted capabilities around a particular type of technology. Let's say, for example, bioengineering. If we make an investment in a material space that has a bioengineering component, we very often then look, as part of the syndicate, for someone who has particular expertise in that field. And the reason why that is important is, I think when you look at a board and the way a board is composed, if you bring together market know-how and market insight, technological expertise, and scale-up expertise, and fundraising expertise, and that expertise very often comes from different types of VCs. But if it comes all together, then that's very, very beneficial to the founder.
I want to ask you one final thing, just to scratch my policy itch that we scratched a bit during this conversation. If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing in the European venture or startup ecosystem to unlock more industrial innovation, what would that be?
We need more funding at the growth stage, and for that to become available, I think we need deregulation in the way large pools of capitals, pension funds, and others can basically deploy capital into venture capital. I think Europe doesn't have an innovation problem. Europe has a funding challenge. When we have companies who need to raise hundreds of millions, that doesn't come by easy in Europe. It comes by far easier in the US, and I think that is a dynamic we have to change.
In the late stage markets, everything here needs a big overhaul, especially in the very, very latest stages when we start talking about the public markets, because right now it's like there's no way that we will ever get the big successes here in Europe and not go to the US if we don't solve that. So I think that's one of the main messages, at least from my side, to our European Union collaborators. Please, let's get the capital union solved.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I can make one more comment, the other thing we need to really change in Europe is our aptitude for risk and our ability and willingness to take risk. I think as much as capital is a challenge, the willingness to really make large bets and to really take risk is something that is so much more pronounced in the US than in Europe. And I think that is one of the reasons why, Europe isn't thriving as it could be and should be, given the sort of, groundswell of innovation and the infrastructure we have. It's scaling those technologies up and really taking risk and being comfortable with risk and being comfortable with failure. However much we talk about it, it's just not quite there yet in the European psyche.
How much of this comment for you, Sebastian, goes to the founder level versus the employee level versus the regulatory level or the customer level? Because my personal take is that I think that founders are probably so much maniacs that however the world is around them, they'll probably do it anyway, at least the breakout founders. But I think that the ecosystem around them. So will people join as first hires? Will people take equity instead of salary? Will your potential customers take you in when you're a startup? Will your regulatory base, so on and so forth?
You're just giving yourself the answer. I mean, I think it's not an issue with the entrepreneurs. It's really an issue with everyone who is then needed in order to make a company ultimately a success.
Yeah, everyone who
employees, the capital, and in particular, capital needs to take much bigger risks. If you think about the amounts of capital that are pooled in Europe and sitting across various pension funds and other vehicles, and how little of it is deployed towards high risk, high reward equations, that really is where we are losing out.
Yeah, completely agree, Sebastian, completely agree. I'm so happy that I made it to ask you that follow-up question, because far too often you say what you say and then people think that you're talking about founders and European ambition level being lower than the US. That is not the case. No. It's everything else. It's all the ecosystem around. So thank you so much for making that point with me. Sebastian, thank you for joining me on the pod today.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Before we start the show, a quick note. If you're building or running a fund, you know it takes the right partners. At EUVC, we only work with sponsors we truly believe should be part of your tech stack. Please do take a moment to hear about them. And if you do, reach out, mention EUVC. It's the best way you can support what we do. Thank you so much. Starting off, HSBC Innovation Banking. If you're a founder, a scale-up, or a VC, you need a bank that actually understands your world. HSBC Innovation Banking backs innovation globally, from seed to IPO. And if you ask me, a strong banking partner like HSBC belongs in your stack. If your portfolio companies are scaling, they need infrastructure that won't slow them down. Google Cloud Starter Program offers $2,000 to $350,000 in credits, plus technical support to build better and faster. It's a key boost every fund should bring into their ecosystem, and oh my God, are we thankful to be partnering with them. Now, legal is a space you cannot lag on. Legal needs to move at the speed of venture. Goodwin's team has decades of experience with startups and funds. They're trusted at every stage from formation to exit. Goodwin definitely is a legal partner every serious manager should have in their stack. For Luxembourg-based VC, PE, and fund-of-fund managers, modern funds means going digital. Fundcraft gives you a full-service, digital native platform built for today's European managers. It's a must-have if you're scaling smart. So we all hear about the Middle East. How about you go there? From AI to deep tech to sovereign fund, SkyTech in Dubai is where global future of tech gets negotiated. It's not just a conference, it's where East meets West, capital meets innovation, and the bold set the agenda. If you're playing on the global stage, join us going to SkyTech this year. If you're gearing up for your next fundraise and want a placement agent who truly understands emerging managers, reach out to C Funds. They're a boutique placement agency that has helped GPs across Europe raise capital from top-tier LPs. We've been on the other side of the table here. They are actually good ones to work with. So I do urge you to go to cfunds.io to go and check them out. And hey, before you go, if you're looking to discover startups, raise capital, or connect with innovation leaders, do check out dealflow.eu, the EU-backed platform bridging founders, VCs, and corporates. There's no better place to find the startups that have received significant funding from the European innovation ecosystem.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of
Let's start acting.